My grandfather died 3 weeks before my 30th birthday. He had lived alone in the same farmhouse for almost 40 years, and everyone in our family believed we already knew every corner of that place. I believed the same thing until the lawyer called and asked me to return because my grandfather had left something that could only be given to me. The farmhouse stood at the end of a gravel road surrounded by cornfields and old maple trees. Nothing had changed since I was a child, except the silence. The front porch still leaned slightly to one side. The windmill behind the barn still turned whenever the breeze was strong enough, and the porch swing still creaked exactly the way it had when my grandfather sat there every evening. Mr. Walker, the family lawyer, was waiting inside the kitchen. He handed me a small wooden box that had my name carved into the lid. There was no money inside, no jewelry, and no deed to the house. Instead, I found an old brass key, a folded blueprint, and a short handwritten note. The note read, "Everyone believes this house has 12 rooms. It never did. Find the 13th room before someone else does." I looked at Mr. Walker and asked whether my grandfather had ever explained what he meant. He slowly shook his head and admitted that he had asked the same question years earlier. My grandfather had smiled, thanked him for preparing the paperwork, and changed the subject. The blueprint looked older than the house itself. Most of it matched the farmhouse perfectly, but one section near the second floor was different. Between my grandfather's bedroom and the attic staircase, a rectangular space appeared on the drawing even though no hallway or room existed there today. At first, I assumed it was a mistake made by the architect. Then, I measured the upstairs hallway. The numbers didn't match. The hallway was almost 9 feet shorter than it should have been. Something occupied the missing space. That evening, I searched every wall, every closet, and every storage cabinet upstairs. Nothing seemed unusual until I noticed that one bookshelf could not be moved. It looked like ordinary furniture, but it had been attached directly to the wall. I pulled harder. Nothing happened. Then I remembered the brass key. The keyhole wasn't visible until I removed 3 old books from the center shelf. Hidden behind them was a tiny brass cover that matched the color of the wood so perfectly it was almost invisible. The key turned without resistance. A quiet click echoed inside the wall. The bookshelf slowly moved outward by itself. Cold air drifted through the opening. Behind the shelf was a narrow hallway that disappeared into darkness. I turned on my phone's flashlight and stepped inside. The air smelled dry, almost untouched by time. Dust covered the floor, but something immediately caught my attention. There was only one set of footprints, fresh footprints. Someone had entered the hidden hallway recently. They led toward a single wooden door at the very end. Unlike every other door in the farmhouse, this one had never been painted. The dark oak looked almost new despite the age of the house. A small envelope had been nailed to the center of the door. Across the front, in my grandfather's handwriting, were 8 words. "If these footprints aren't yours, leave immediately." I looked back. The footprints behind me were clearly mine, which meant the ones ahead of me belonged to someone else. I stood perfectly still and listened. The hidden hallway was silent except for the faint sound of air moving through the walls. Whoever had walked here before me was no longer inside, or at least that was what I wanted to believe. I lowered my flashlight toward the floor. The footprints were sharp and easy to follow. They had been made by heavy work boots, much larger than mine, and the dust around them had not settled yet. Someone had entered this passage recently, perhaps only a day or 2 earlier. I reached the wooden door and removed the envelope. Inside was another note. "If you're reading this, you already know the room exists. The next decision will change everything. Once you unlock this door, you will never believe the story our family has repeated for 30 years. My grandfather had signed the note with nothing more than the letter G. The brass key fit the lock immediately. I hesitated. For most of my life, our family had repeated the same story about my grandmother. She had died in a house fire before I was born. There were no photographs from her final years because, according to my grandfather, everything had been destroyed in the fire. No one questioned the story. No one searched for another explanation. I slowly turned the key. The lock released with a deep metallic click. The room was much larger than I expected. It looked less like a storage space and more like a private office that had been sealed for decades. A large wooden desk stood beneath a narrow window. Shelves covered one wall from floor to ceiling. Hundreds of boxes were carefully labeled with dates stretching back more than 30 years. Nothing looked abandoned. Everything looked preserved. as though someone had expected another person to return one day. The first object I noticed was a framed family photograph sitting on the desk. It showed my grandfather, my grandmother, my father, and a little girl around 6 years old. I stared at the picture. I had never seen that little girl before. She wasn't my aunt. She wasn't anyone I recognized. When I turned the frame over, another sentence was written on the back. Our family didn't lose one child. My heart began to race. My father had always told me he grew up as an only child. If this photograph was real, someone had been erased from our family's history. I opened the top drawer of the desk. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes, each marked with a year. Beneath them rested several journals tied together with leather straps. On top of everything lay a sealed letter addressed to me. The handwriting belonged to my grandfather. I opened it carefully. If you found this room, then I waited too long to tell you the truth. Everything your father believes is based on a lie that I created. I convinced myself it was the only way to protect the family, but every year that passed made the truth more difficult to reveal. I kept reading. The little girl in the photograph was your father's younger sister. Her name was Hannah. I stopped. I read the sentence again. My father had a sister. No one had ever mentioned her. Not once. The letter continued. Everyone believes Hannah died during the fire. She didn't. A loud sound came from somewhere below the house. I looked toward the door. The noise disappeared. For several seconds, I heard nothing. Then another sound echoed through the hidden hallway. A slow footstep. Someone else was inside the passage. I quietly switched off my flashlight. Darkness filled the room. The footsteps moved closer, one, then another. They stopped just outside the door. A beam of light swept across the hallway. Someone whispered, almost too quietly to hear. He's already found the room. A second voice answered. Then we're too late. I held my breath. The two strangers remained outside for several seconds before walking back toward the hidden entrance. Their footsteps slowly faded until the hallway became silent again. Only then did I turn my flashlight back on. My hands were shaking. Whoever those people were, they already knew about the hidden room. More importantly, they knew I was inside it. I hurried back to the desk and unfolded the remaining pages of my grandfather's letter. The people looking for this room are not searching for money. They are searching for one document. If they find it before you do, Hannah will disappear for a second time. I frowned. Disappear? My grandfather had written that Hannah survived. How could she disappear again? The final page answered part of the question. She is still alive. The sentence felt impossible. According to every official record, my aunt had died more than 30 years earlier. Yet my grandfather had written those words only 6 months before his own death. At the bottom of the page, he added one final instruction. Do not tell your father until you know why I lied to him. I folded the letter and slipped it into my jacket. As I turned toward the shelves, my flashlight landed on a small metal box sitting by itself on the highest shelf. Unlike everything else in the room, it had no dust. Someone had touched it recently. I reached for the metal box and carefully lifted it from the shelf. It was surprisingly light, and unlike the other objects in the room, its lock was already open. Inside were 3 items: a passport issued only 5 years earlier, a faded newspaper clipping, and a sealed envelope marked, "Open this last." The passport belonged to a woman named Hannah Grace Carter. The photograph showed the same little girl from the family picture, only much older. She was alive. I stared at the date of birth. It matched the age my father's missing sister would have been today. The newspaper clipping explained what had happened all those years ago. 32 years earlier, a fire had destroyed an old guest house several miles from the farmhouse. Authorities believed a young girl had died inside because they found clothing and personal belongings that belonged to Hannah. No body had ever been positively identified, but the investigation was closed within days. My grandfather had known the truth from the beginning. The fire had been staged. Hannah had escaped before the building collapsed. I finally opened the sealed envelope. Inside was the longest letter my grandfather had ever written. He admitted that someone had tried to kidnap Hannah after discovering that she had accidentally witnessed a violent crime committed by 2 influential businessmen in the county. Those men had powerful friends, and my grandfather became convinced that no one could protect his family if the truth became public. With the help of a trusted judge and a federal investigator, Hannah was secretly placed into a witness protection program. To keep her alive, the entire town was allowed to believe she had died in the fire. Even my father was never told the truth because, as a frightened teenager, he might have unknowingly revealed that she was still alive. My grandfather wrote that lying to his own son was the hardest decision of his life, but every threat against the family stopped after Hannah's supposed death. Years passed. Hannah built a new life under a different identity, and eventually the danger faded. Still, my grandfather never forgave himself for separating two children who loved each other. The final page contained an address in Oregon and one simple request. If it is finally safe, tell your father that his sister never stopped loving him. I left the hidden room carrying the box and the letters. The farmhouse felt different now, not because the walls had changed, but because the silence finally made sense. My grandfather had not hidden treasure. He had hidden the truth. The next morning, I drove to my father's house. He smiled when he opened the door, but the smile disappeared as soon as he saw the old family photograph in my hands. "Where did you find that?" he asked quietly. "In Grandpa's hidden room." His face turned pale. There wasn't supposed to be a hidden room. There was. I placed the photograph, the passport, and my grandfather's letter on the kitchen table. He read every page without saying a word. When he reached the sentence that confirmed Hannah was alive, his hands began to tremble. He removed his glasses, covered his face, and cried harder than I had ever seen. For more than 30 years, he had believed he had lost his little sister forever. An hour later, we called the phone number attached to the Oregon address. A woman answered. I introduced myself and explained why I was calling. There was a long silence before she spoke. "I've been waiting for someone from home." My father could barely say her name. "Hannah?" The woman started crying. "So you finally know." 3 weeks later, we flew to Oregon together. When Hannah walked into the room, neither of them moved at first. They simply looked at each other, searching for the faces they remembered as children. Then my father stepped forward, wrapped his arms around his sister, and held her as though he were making up for 3 lost decades. No explanation could return the years they had missed, but the truth gave them something they thought was impossible: a second chance. Before we left, Hannah handed me one last envelope. "It was Grandpa's final instruction," she said. "He asked me to give you this only after we were together again." Inside was a single handwritten sentence. "Family secrets can protect people for a time, but love cannot survive forever without the truth. When the danger is gone, let honesty bring everyone home." As we drove away, I looked back at my grandfather's farmhouse one last time. The hidden room was no longer a place of fear. It had become the place where our family's real history finally came back into the light. The end